Thank you, sir. I guess that gets us ready to open up here. Jake, are you on board?
I am.
Okay, can you give us I think there's some confusion. Is it, there is one or two ordinances? Which one are we talking about? With the Airbnb? We've got two copies, didn't we? Yes, no? Not here, but I mean, on the internet? All right, well, about this.
I think they're the same, Mr.
Right.
President. I believe they're the same.
Okay. So can you give us a quick overview? And then we can have everybody ask the questions they need to ask. Jake?
Okay, thank you, everybody. This is something that the Planning Commission's been working on for several months since, really the issue was brought to the city's attention. Obviously, we've gotten to the point where back in March, the Planning Commission had finalized the draft of the proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance that would, allow for these short-term rentals to be permitted in various zoning districts within the city and set forth operational conditions that they need to abide by in order to be approved. What you should have in front of you or have seen previously would be the March 11th, 2021 draft of those proposed zoning ordinance amendments. And that's essentially what was discussed at the public hearing from the 19th of May.
Can you explain the confusion that owner occupied? Are they saying that the owner has to be at the house when they're renting it out? Are we stopping, LLCs of opening up 8 or 10 of them? Do you understand my question, or am I confusing it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's kind of two separate questions, but related, obviously. What was drafted with the owner occupied status for properties for short-term rentals that would operate in an R1 or an R1A district doesn't mean that the owner needs to be in the building when it is being rented. However, it does imply that the owner would be residing at that location for a good portion of the year, and that location be listed as the owner's primary address.
Oh, okay.
Jake, where did that come from? That idea? Is that modeled on another city? Because we know that there are people, because we haven't had regulations. We know people have invested in properties, and I think it's unfair to assume that these are out-of-town corporations. There was a woman who spoke at the public hearing who has a place called the Little Itty Bitty Bungalow. She does not live there. It's in the city of Erie. So where did it come from, and why the distinction? Where is R1 and R1A? So I think that there's a whole lot that we have to consider before we are close to approving anything. So I had asked earlier today if we could have a map. I don't know all the zoning things, but I'm looking at the Airbnb right now. There's, for the 4th of July weekend, there's one house for available in the Cockwood neighborhood. But if you go farther out, there are houses that are advertised close to Frontier. You don't have the exact address. So could you explain if other cities have this distinction, and what is R1 and R1A in Erie? Not how is it defined, but what neighborhoods are we talking about?
Thank you. Jake, you got
Well,
that one?
essentially, R1 and R1A, generally speaking, would include essentially the southern tier of Erie. In other words, most of the residential neighborhoods south of 26th Street, for instance, are predominantly R1 or R1A. And of course, Northwest Erie, the frontier area, and Northeast Erie, the lakeside area.
Jake, is
Those would be the areas that are predominantly
Jake.
R1 or R1A.
What's the
in
A
city.
stand for? I think that was the question, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, and that's a good question, because essentially the similarity between R1 and R1A is that you have the same list of permitted uses. They're both restricted to single-family residential dwellings only. They don't allow for flats, 2 units, 3 or 4 units, any other type of residential dwellings other than single family. The difference between R1 and R1A is the R1A districts were identified in previous versions of the zoning map. They really correlate to portions of the city that were subdivided into smaller, more dense lots. So essentially they're the same as R1, but the lots are much smaller in size, generally speaking. Those are the R1 neighborhoods in the city, and there's pockets of them, say for instance, between 26th and 32nd Street, let's just say, east and west of Peach. And then when you get further south, as the city developed, later subdivisions, the parcels were larger, and those are your more typical R1 districts.
Thank you.
Do we have any idea? I don't know why this is echoing. How many short-term rentals there are within the city of Erie? Now, it varies by when you're trying to book. If you look for July 4th, that house that I mentioned that's in the Coquitlam neighborhood is renting for $300 a night. But I found a place on Harvard, which would be available in October. My concern is that we know that there have been some vocal opponents and proponents to this. I have a hunch that a lot of people in the city of Erie don't even know these regulations are being proposed, and they may have bought something and don't intend to have that as their primary residence. And they're going to end up being shortchanged by this, including I don't know if the woman who has the itty bitty bungalow, if that's R1 or R1A. So did we start out with working backwards to know how many are already out there? And it's not just Airbnb, because there's also vacation rental by owner. So do we have any idea how many at any given time are available in Erie?
Now, we haven't done an analysis of the specific locations as far as the difference in numbers of rental opportunities in R1 versus the other zoning districts in the city. But there's, like you said, Liz, at any one time, you may see 50 or 100 properties that are located in the city of Erie that are advertising themselves for short-term rental opportunities. We don't have those numbers quantified. It's difficult to kind of quantify those numbers, obviously. What I can tell you is that people that have contacted my office asking about potential investments and investment properties for short-term rentals, I have been telling them actually for the last year or so anyway, since it's become more prominent in the discussion, that we've been working on regulations that essentially properties that are located in zoning districts where other types of short-term lodging are already permitted are likely to be approved for short-term residential rentals to be permitted as well. And in fact, folks that have asked me if they could operate a short-term rental in a property that happens to be in a commercial district, my answer has been yes. Because essentially, if you want to consider that in the absence of a definition of a short-term rental, they could be considered a type of hotel, short-term lodging arrangement, those are already permitted in those commercial districts. So the answers vary depending on the folks that are calling and what locations specifically they're looking at. But we have to base our answers on the existing ordinance, and then I've given them some advice based on what the proposed recommendations are as far as future investment.
Don't you think, though, that it wasn't until the controversy erupted? Well, I shouldn't say, what do you think? What I think is that until the controversy erupted in Pittsburgh, I'm sorry, in Glenwood, people were not aware that they weren't allowed to do this. I mean, you know, the attorney can speak, you know, knowledgeably about the slice of life decision, but I don't think most people knew that that existed in Pennsylvania. So, and do we know, how have other municipalities in Pennsylvania responded to slice of life? I know that some totally, I think, banned short-term rentals, but do we know how other cities have regulated short-term rentals since the slice of life decision? Anybody?
I don't have statistics, but I'm aware of several municipalities that enacted legislation regulating it, saying what's allowed, where it's allowed, and what the rules are. And I think that that's really the guidance that comes from the Supreme Court, is essentially saying that if you're just calling it single family rental, that by just those words does not include short-term rental. So if you want it to include short-term rental, you better say it. If you don't say it, then the Supreme Court's guidance is that it's not permitted. And so what I think most municipalities, Erie and every other municipality in Pennsylvania, is now stuck with the burden of figuring out where should these be permitted, where should they not be permitted, and what the rules are that apply to them, because it's something new. But to the extent that you've raised that we could have, I mean, I want everybody to I don't want anybody ever to be upset, but if you're going to say, well, we have, you know, in essence, innocent victims here, I think that anyone that contacted the city has been told that there's an issue out here that is pending resolution. And those that have not contacted the city, those people have, I presume, not obtained any type of residential rental license and are not complying with the city's residential rental program, which is out there to ensure safety and have inspections of properties.
All right, but how were they supposed to know that? I mean, because short-term rentals are different than other types of rentals. And we do know that there are probably property owners out there who do long-term rentals who haven't complied with the licensing requirements. I mean,
there's no doubt that there are people that have not complied. I just, and I'm not saying that, you know, that doesn't, there's a lot of reasons that can happen, but you lose the ability to say that you're the innocent victim when you haven't contacted. If you're going to use your property, whether short-term or long-term, for business purposes, it's incumbent upon you to check with the city or any other municipality what the rules are in that municipality. And if you call today and say, can I run an Airbnb or a VRBO from my house? The answer is, absent legislation allowing it by the city right now, the answer is no.
when was the slice of life decision handed down? Do you know what year that was?
I don't have the date. I year and a half ago, I want to say, but I don't have it in front of me.
I have a question both for Ed and for Jake. Unmute. There, I'm back. The legislation in front of us, if we pass it or not pass it, will it have anything to do with what's out there now? Or are they grandfathered? Or what are we gonna do? Go out and license them? You know what I'm saying? The big brouhaha, like Liz said, is coming from Glenwood. But there's 4 or 5 of them up there making most of the noise.
Well,
Whatever legislation we do, we can't tell them to cease and desist if they've already been doing it. I don't think. That's what I'm asking.
no, that is not correct. They
Can you
are
tell me
currently
something?
there is no authorization for them currently to be operating. And so if you allow it, anybody that is operating would have to follow whatever the rules are of the legislation. If you prohibit it, then they would need to cease and desist.
Thank you. Good clarification.
Okay, slice of life ruling was April 26th, 2019.
19.
So we had, less than a year before COVID hit and affected everything. I mean, short-term rentals were actually, I think, shut down in Pennsylvania, especially in the Poconos, where people were coming from out of state as a health measure. So in my mind, it's possible. I mean, I'm not trying to say that they're innocent victims. I don't want to apply any definition to people. But before April 26th, 2019, my hunch is that people, because it wasn't defined in the the regular rental ordinance,
What's your point,
might have
Liz?
just started doing it without, I mean, we're kind of saying, we're slapping their hands and saying, you should have anticipated that a Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision would come down in 2019. And you should have called the city zoning office, because we know that everybody is complying with city zoning and code enforcement. And I'm being sarcastic about that right now. So.
No, you're absolutely right. I think that there would have been a fair presumption that you're allowed to do it. The problem is, if you're not reporting what you're doing and you're operating a business from your home, that's on you. You need to know the rules. You cannot start an industrial operation in your garage and then say, well, I didn't know. It's my garage. It is on the property owner. It's their burden to make sure they're in compliance. That being said, you're absolutely right, Ms. Allen. If you would have called me the day before Slice of Life comes out, and you would have called the zoning office was not taking the position that it was prohibited. The city did not prohibit it, and the city's operation, and I think most legal analysis would be that if it is not prohibited, you can do it. You have a right as a general rule to use your property however you want, unless the municipality prohibits it. This case, this Slice of Life case, flips it all around. I've never seen anything like it really with this analysis in 30 years. It now says that if it's not specifically permitted, it is deemed prohibited. So you're absolutely right, Ms. Allen. If I were operating, again, I should be reporting and doing my inspections of my home and complying with zoning. But the city of Erie would not have stopped an Airbnb, because you can do whatever you want with it unless it's prohibited. It was not prohibited. Slice of Life changed it and changed the burden for the property owner and for the city that now the city has to specifically identify where it wants to allow these, or they're deemed prohibited.
Okay.
There's another wrinkle here. You know, the zoning hearing board, their original decision. So I think we need to know all the context of this, and not everybody was on city council. I've been following this issue since I came on city council because I knew it was going to be something that had to be addressed. So 11/15/2017, 2 years before Slice of Life, the zoning hearing board upheld the zoning office ruling that said you're permitted to have an Airbnb. So, you know, these are people, this is the Glenwood home. They were trying to do what they were told they could do. So there's a lot to unpack here. We're dealing with, and as Ed Bessa has told us, zoning hearing board is quasi judicial, you know, it's independent. I just think people need to know that, so that, you know, we aren't saying that one side's a villain and one side's, you know, I'm trying to make them an innocent victim. There's decisions that have been made here. Now, if you lived in R1 and you read this story from November of 2017 that said, you know, zoning said, our code said you could have this, then wouldn't you say, well, if they can do it, I can do it? That's just my thought. This is a mess, is what I would say.
Well,
We're trying to solve it.
You're right though, but remember that case was up on appeal. And
Right.
So until it's a final decision, but the zoning hearing board made exactly the decision that I really would have expected them to make. You're permitted to use your property however you want, unless it's prohibited. The city of Erie did not prohibit it. So it would not have surprised me that the zoning hearing board found the way it did. The Slice of Life case is what changes things. And so at the end of the day, I mean, to me, I don't think it matters necessarily. I mean, I think the history is nice to know, but ultimately, what do you want to allow and where do you want to allow it?
Good point. I have another question too. I'm going to take it a step further. I think the biggest problem with this is regulation. I mean, I think Liz asked you, how many do we have in the city of Erie? And we don't know that yet. No, not your fault, not our fault, nobody's fault, but we don't know that. So what are we going to do? Get a Airbnb club and go around and look for places or wait for people to complain like the folks in Glenwood did? You know, Liz is right. It's a pretty wacky situation, and it's changing too, if it's still going to appeal. My question is that, do we know how many? I know that's the only one I ever heard being complained about, but I understand there's a bunch of them along Front Street or along the bay there. I don't know that for a fact, you know, specifically, but how are we going to manage something that we don't know is out there? That's my question. Can you help me?
It's a code enforcement issue. So, I mean, how exactly?
Well, I mean, I would say that, I mean, you deal with it just as you did with the rental registration program when it launched. You have to identify the properties that fit this definition and get them registered. Some of them, and I don't know how, I don't know if Jake knows this, some of them are registered rentals because that's how they're being used. Those that are only part-time renting and haven't registered, which would be, I mean, I think they're normally they would have registered as rentals anyway. So it just falls within the same category, Ed, as we've got to identify those that, and it's usually someone a neighbor calling and identifying, a problem with the property or calling them out if the property owner hasn't already registered now. They may already be registered, and we just have to define those, really the ones that are in the single family districts as special exceptions now that have to go through a different process. So that's really what we're talking about. It's not really the entirety of the city. It's really just in the R1 and R1A that we're going to have to define and get them through the special exception or special use process. So
I'd venture to say there's more R in R1A. Feedback.
I'm sorry, Ed,
Sorry.
what was that? It was an echo.
I'm just trying to say there's an awful lot of residential properties out there in comparison to commercial area places. You know what my point? And again, I'm sure we can get a program together to regulate it, having people sign up. How are we gonna make sure that Miss Morris, as an example, up there on Upland, is gonna come back to Erie and live in Glenwood for 6 months to keep her Airbnb an owner occupied dwelling?
It's
See
going to
what
be
I'm saying?
tough. It's going to be
Yeah.
tough. I mean,
I
it's
just
it's an imperfect system unless you have an officer who's going to go out and interview the property owners. I mean, you're right. It's the logistics of it is tough. The laws on the books does allow, would give the city some enforcement measures if that situation was proven. So, I mean, in that case, we can be reactionary to when we discover the ones that are not following the letter of the law. But that regulation is going to be tough to figure out and to enforce, and it becomes complicated. No doubt.
Is there a logical process for us to get that regulated? Jake? Do you have, can you put out, I don't know, can't be a mailer. I don't know how you would get that out there to say, all of you folks who are operating these, please come to City Hall and make application. How are we gonna do that? And we have to do something. That's the bottom line. We can't just sit back. The folks up in Glenwood already spent well over $20,000 with an attorney, not realizing that we have the final say down here anyway. But, they're concerned. They're very concerned. Yeah, other neighborhoods maybe be the same thing. But, the big fear statement is, would you want a rental living next to you?
Well, and keep in mind too, Ed, that, if you decide we don't want Airbnbs in R1A or short-term rentals in R1, R1A, we're going to have to follow the same process, because it's going to have to be, we're going to have to go out, identify the ones that are short-term rentals and take legal action. So it's not an easy, I don't know, again, how many of those that we're going to do, we're not sure, but that we're going to have to deal with. So either way, either decision is going to take some logistics and some staff time for sure. And there's going to be unhappy people. That doesn't mean though, that property is going to convert into an owner occupied home. Someone could just say, okay, I'm going to rent it for a year.
Right.
It doesn't disqualify it from them being able to rent it for a year and it being just converted to a full-time rental. That is permitted. That is a single family use. So, it's really
180-day question though. Where did 180 days come from? And I want to go back to Ed's question about how to regulate, and I'm not pushing City Grows, but I did the City Grows webinar about 2 weeks ago on short-term rentals. And so there were people on the webinar from Ohio, Pennsylvania, California, and probably 1 or 2 other states. So it isn't just Erie and it's not just Pennsylvania grappling with this. But one of the things that they touted, we already use City Grows for some of our functions at Erie City Hall. One of the things that Catherine touted is that the database would be searchable. So neighbors would be able to go in and search and see if a property had actually been registered with the city short-term rental program. That sounded interesting to me. But the 180 days, it just seems, it's half the year. And I think I asked where it came from, but I don't think I heard where that number came from, 180 days. And what difference does that make? Are we thinking somebody's gonna live in Florida for 6 months out of the year? I don't know. I don't get the arbitrary 180 days.
I believe, and Jake can maybe chime in a little bit more about the discussion, it exactly was that. It wasn't arbitrary. It was at least half of your time is spent in your home and the other half could be spent in a second home. This also is your primary residence. So half of the year, about 180 days was the conclusion. It was as simple as that, Liz.
And what about the woman who said, again, I'm not talking about the Glenwood woman, I'm talking about Claudine, who pretty much was ready to throw up her hands. You know, she took a little house. Now maybe I don't know, maybe she's not in R1 or 1A. It's over near 22nd or 23rd and Green Garden. But she said she bought that, she rehabbed it, she doesn't live there. And she can only rent it out half the year now. So, and I suspect that there's other people like that. I just saw one. I saw one on Airbnb, and they don't have the addresses, but there was one that I think was advertised as being close to Gridley Park. And I think I saw it when I drove down here. And I know that the person who rehabbed a property and lives in one right next door to it, I think has an Airbnb. I mean, and is putting, you know, sweat equity into the city. I just, but again, I think it's the R1A, and I think we're going to have, we're assuming that if you buy something and you want to rent it short term, you must be a scumbag. And I just talked to somebody who has a lot of properties in the West Bayfront area, has been investing for years, and is finally making some money, because it's nice to be able to get, you know, say $300 a week versus, you know, $600 a month. I think we need to hear from some more, even though they didn't come to the public hearing. I think we need to really inform ourselves about who we're impacting here, including the neighbors who have concerns. That was on that webinar I was on. Again, this was people all over the country. And we did one of those instant polls, and the top concern was, you know, party houses and disrupting the neighborhood. So that's a legitimate, honest concern.
So I am going on vacation in July, and I did my research, and the place where I'm staying says they will not allow people in that city to stay there. They have to be from out of town. And I noticed in Erie too, in talking to a hotel person, they also had the same policy. If you wanted to stay in their place, you had to live out of town. And that, he told me, prevents people from using it as a drug meeting place or party place, what have you. So I think it's a matter of setting the rules and the laws. Hawaii has short-term rentals allowed in hotel, resort, commercial, and multifamily commercial zones, but not in residential owned places, zoned. Pittsburgh allows it. Philadelphia has short-term rentals. Poconos allows it, except for in residential places, in residential zones. Philadelphia has it. It's a matter of us putting strictly, okay, this is allowed, this isn't allowed, but it is, like you said, Liz, it's a matter of enforcement. And that's the whole problem with everything going on right now. We have fireworks, but not enforced. We have people doing rehab on their houses, but not pulling a building permit. And that sort of thing is a problem.
I had a question. I think isn't the biggest argument that it's going to bring down values in neighborhoods or it's going to disturb neighborhoods? But I think I asked this before, what other existing cities have had this enacted in place for? Or it hasn't been enacted long enough to really say that it's been a detriment or not? You know, it's kind of a negative question. But is there any proven cities that have had enacted this that it's been good or tested at all?
I don't know of any specific studies on the impacts of Airbnb, but I know how long they've been around. And so the impact of the court case, of course, is too early to tell. We're here now reacting to what has been handed down to us from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And that's what we're trying to deal with.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm like Kathy, everywhere I go, I stay in an Airbnb. That's how I usually operate. It's rarely I'm in a hotel. So I have a sense of how these work and how I do my due diligence to find the ones that are appropriately located, that have good reviews, that have AAA A rating owners. So, in that respect, I do appreciate the ability to find properties that honestly, I wouldn't have a database that comprehensive if I was trying to rent an apartment or a house somewhere as I do through Airbnb, but that's my own just personal information. So again, we have to contemplate that these are not going to be converted into owner occupied properties. These more than likely will be converted into long-term rentals. So I think your comparison is which is better for the neighborhood, long-term rentals or short-term rentals. That's really the comparison. If they were a high demand for homes, they would already be owner occupied homes.
Another question, could things change if the Supreme Court ruling changes? And if that would happen, would what we do before this final appeal is done, would that force us to change what we are doing? Am I making sense? Ed, help me.
It could. It's not likely to. The Supreme Court essentially, it's a very long decision, but essentially it's saying to the municipalities, you decide what you want. What they're simply saying is, in the absence of you defining single.
We lost you.
Yeah, we lost Ed.
You muted, Ed.
Can
He went back to mute.
you hear me?
Yeah.
I apologize. The Supreme Court is just simply telling the municipalities to decide what you want in your districts, but they will not simply allow an assumption that you're including short-term rentals when you say single-family residence. You need to decide what you want. So I don't see the Supreme Court changing their ruling. I think their ruling is putting the burden back on the municipality to dictate what it wants and what it doesn't want.
So in that case, we do move forward with trying to do. In the meantime, Jake, can we figure out some kind of a way to at least get a list of what we have in the city? Or not? I'm just asking. Renee, help me. Somebody help me. I'm reaching for ideas.
I'm gonna let's just go down that rabbit hole a little, Ed. Let's say we are able to compile a list, because I put up my Airbnb app on my phone just so how many are actually listed. What if we come back and say there's 100? How did, or what if we come back and say there's 10? How does that impact your decision of whether or not to allow them or not?
The
Just-
impact is the decision of how to regulate them. I don't care if it's 5 or
So
700. I'm saying, how do we identify them?
Yeah. I think how we identify it is an issue, no matter if there's 1 or if there's 100.
Exactly.
So
agree with you.
I just suggest that, Ed. I don't know that it's going to uncover any new information that's going to help us make this decision.
I didn't mean to imply that at all. I'm just saying it might be advantageous to have a better idea of
How
what
many
kind
people were affected?
yeah, that's it.
Well, I mean,
The effective
it-
burden.
it's going to be really hard. And again, how many you're affecting? Let's say you're affecting 100, Jim. How does that impact your decision today? Are you going to remove the owner occupancy requirement? Say, all right, you don't
My
have.
question is where are they located?
What's that?
My question was where are they located? That's one of the things I'm pondering, you know, the quantity, but also where they located. I have an idea, but
And I mean, we can go down that route and try to pull some data for you. Again, at the end of the day, I'm not sure it's going to necessarily change the decisions here. It's like Ed has, as Mr. Betza has, I have to differentiate the Eds. Sorry. I can't even say Ed B. It's Mr. Betza has suggested, and I'm not arguing with you. I'm just trying to see if there is you know, if there's things that we can do to better help make this decision happen. Because it's been, you know, the Planning Commission has spent a long time discussing this and listening to the arguments from both sides. And as Frank has put in the chat, you know, we would probably go to the websites. I would go to their apps, and that's how I'm going to pull the ones that we have. I don't know that we can differentiate the ones, Jake, out of our rental registration program, because I don't think they necessarily say that they're short-term versus long-term rentals. So I don't think that's going to prove. So we're going to go to the apps and see what's already listed and figure out where they're at. Hopefully they're accurately located. The addresses might be hard to determine because sometimes you don't know the address until you book it. So we can, the data is going to be lacking no matter what we do, but that's where I would start.
Yeah, Kathy, that's good. I didn't mean to digress with it. Unofficial poll of the board tells me that the votes are already there to pass it. Tonight, I think was more a night of clarification. I think I'm right, Liz, that we're trying to do, clarify the murkiness of what they're talking about.
That's a
That's where
good
I'm
way
coming
of
from.
putting it.
Murkiness.
Murkiness.
I make up words.
I'm just trying to get a complete understanding so I know everything.
I know there's been a lot of discussion, but just asking these questions just give you a better depth, so you make that decision, you know, you're making it with
Full knowledge, that's all.
Exactly. Yeah.
I also would
I'm
like a
just-
map. I'm sorry.
I'm literally surfing the Airbnb website and looking at a map. And you can scroll around the city map to see which ones are, and it does just give you kind of a general location. Doesn't give you a specific address. But what I'm seeing as I'm scrolling around on the map is there are a lot of locations that are in the West Bayfront area that would predominantly be R2 areas as far as the zoning is concerned. There are certainly a mix. I see as you zoom in and out of the map, you know, these locations pop up with the price point, which I'm assuming is the nightly cost. So they're kind of dispersed throughout the city. I don't think that you could say from what I'm seeing as I'm going in and out of this map that they're predominantly located in R1 areas or not. So to try and quantify the impact of the regulations that you know, specific to R1 and R1A, which is going to be more restrictive for Airbnb owners. It's tough to say how many exactly people potentially or properties would be impacted at any one given time.
Jake and Kathy, you mentioned that you heard a lot of people at planning commission meetings. I think I haven't gone to any of those meetings. I think they're probably available on our YouTube channel. I think it would be useful for council to go back and listen to what the people on both sides had to say, because there may have been different voices there than appeared at our public hearing. I will also point out that I think Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was trying to figure out how to regulate, and they were going to have regulations. It looked like pretty similar to what we're proposing. And then the newspaper did a story about how many members of city council stayed at Airbnbs that were like non-owner occupied when they go on vacation. And it turned out it was sort of like, what's that? Do as I say, not as I do. So I thought that was interesting. But I think if you could direct us to those YouTubes for the meetings, I would feel like I've educated myself a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah, we can certainly do that. Just personally, I don't stay in Airbnbs where the owner is there. I have my own space. But the also know that the planning commission's role on behalf of city and city council is to be the convener of those discussions, and that's certainly what the job that they did for you is. They came back and they modified the massage, they asked staff to go back, brought in other examples, have reports. So also I just want to make sure you're confident in the work that the planning commission has done on your behalf to bring you the ordinance in its current draft form. They've listened to all of those different nuances and had multiple meetings and discussions about it. But we can certainly direct you for those videos.
That was never an issue.
Yeah. Oh, no, I
They
just
did
wanted
good-
to make sure you were
good job.
aware
I
that.
do have one other big question. Do we expect any kind of revenue from this situation? If we regulate them, we got to charge them to regulate them, right? Maybe we can add some revenue to our base. Renee,
We'll
what do you
just,
think?
I think we're going to cover the cost of regulating, which is all we can do with fees.
So no profit involved then, right?
Well, hopefully the properties are being maintained and the value of those properties, therefore the
see.
tax that's generated
Good point.
will come back to
Okay.
the city.
And they actually do need to be paying that hotel tax. I mean, I know that came down in Pennsylvania.
Mm.
So
Another-
the hotel tax does benefit Visit Erie. But I have one more question for Ed Betza. There's still, the Dimitrovich decision is still hanging out there. Is that right about this? I mean, yeah, I guess what I'm thinking is what would be helpful would be like just sort of a timeline, zoning hearing board did this, Dimitrovich did this, appeal did this, Supreme Court did this, just like 5 or 6 things so we could follow that, I think would be helpful. But
Yeah. I will send you a timeline. I don't think that we're waiting on any clear direction from any.
Bye, Ed.
Speaker issues.
Can you hear me?
we can now.
I don't know what's going on. I apologize. I'm trying to use the phone and I think it's my cheekbone is hitting the mute button. But so I'm holding it away from my face now. But I think that we're not waiting on a court to tell us what to do. The courts are really waiting on us to say what we want, what we don't want.
Right, it's my understanding that that's kind of, because we have agreed to tackle this, I think, specifically, the Glenwood people kind of have bought themselves some time is my impression. And I shouldn't speak for, I'm not speaking for them or the lawyer or anything, but I'm not saying we need to wait for the court hearing, but I think that the judge knows that we're trying to come up with something. So I think.
I think that's accurate. I think that's accurate.
So our plan would be to put it on the next meeting for the vote. Renee, Kathy, what do you think?
That is absolutely up to council.
Yeah,
How you
I think
feel.
it's,
You guys.
I'm sorry.
well, I mean, it's
Okay,
up to
we'll-
you if you
We'll
feel
do it
the
then.
need
I'm
to
just
make
looking
any
for
changes.
consensus.
It's up to you. You gotta, you know,
Yeah.
yeah, we'll
Scott
provide
came
you
in,
more
that's a
information.
cigar. I'm just here trying to get everybody together.
Yeah,
If
I
everybody
mean,
thinks it's a good idea, let's do it.
right now,
Yes,
our
yeah.
marching orders is maybe a timeline, and
Yeah.
it sounds like everyone's gonna go home and pull up the Airbnb apps and do their own sort of research and investigation.
Right.
And Liz, we can pull out those YouTube videos if you want to sit through some of them. They are lengthy. You'll get a lot of information. I don't know you'll get any new information, but you'll get more of it for sure.
I have a question in a different vein. Cathedral Prep. This just got dropped on.
That was from this afternoon, Ed.
Oh, that's not.
They
today.
used our
Okay.
place for a meeting.
So they got the variance?
No,
It wasn't a variance, it was a variance from a building
Tornado thing.
code. I'm not sure what the outcome was.
Okay. That's-
I do have two things to say. There is a difference between staying in a place where the owner is home and is using the same room as like a recreational room, what have you, and staying in a place where the owner is not at home. There is a difference. A couple years ago, Larry and I were at a place, and for most of the part, thankfully, we had the place to ourselves, but then the owners did come home and they were like hoverers. And that normally doesn't happen, but when they're like sort of hovering over you and, you know, when you just want to be, that is different, but it doesn't always happen. But we started 38 years ago in June, stayed at a bed and breakfast in Massachusetts. And ever since then, it just sort of hooked us onto going to different places. Another thing I do want to comment, though, is, in my opinion, people who own short-term rentals, their places perhaps are nicer than people who are renting their houses long-term. Unfortunately, not every landowner is a good landlord. So if you want people to stay and come frequently, like every weekend, and you want good reviews from everybody, your place is going to be nice, especially the landscaping around the house as well. Usually there's more gardens and nicely landscaped place to make it inviting. Thank you.
Anything else for the good of the?
I'm sorry, just one more
Liz.
thing.
I have a couple of comments just to clarify some of the discussion that's taken place. As far as the zoning hearing board, you know, kind of the short and sweet of that was that initially when the use of the property on Upland was questioned by a nearby resident, the zoning office investigated and determined that the use of the property did not violate the definition of a single family dwelling. The owner lived there for portions of the year, and when the property was rented out, it was only rented out to single families at any one time. So at the time, that was determined to not be a violation of the zoning ordinance and not violate the definition of a single family dwelling. The zoning hearing board, when it was appealed to them, upheld the decision of the zoning office. It didn't say that Airbnbs were permitted. What it said was the use of that specific property was not violating the single-family dwelling use. That was then appealed again by Glenwood, and the judge essentially was kind of sitting on it for a while, knowing that that slice of life decision was pending. And once slice of life came out that said the use of a property solely as a short-term rental is not really a dwelling. And once that was put out there, she basically remanded the case back to the zoning hearing board, and they reversed their previous decision because of the slice of life saying, well, if somebody is just using this residence as a short-term rental, then it's not really a dwelling. You can't consider it a dwelling anymore unless you regulate it as such. That's kind of what the timeline was with the zoning hearing board. And then that was appealed again by the property owners, and that's still out there, as I believe what the current status is. And Liz, to your other question about the folks from the planning commission meetings, I will tell you that most of the folks that you've heard at the public hearing and previous council meetings are essentially the same folks. So I think you're gonna hear a lot of repetition from the planning commission meetings that you also heard at the council meetings.
I just wanted to say, I think that Kathy Schaaf and I, when we went to that itty bitty bungalow, I think it was right before COVID. And there were some other Airbnb owners who came, and Kathy and I, we're always, coming up with these brainstorms. We were like, we're going to go on a tour of Airbnbs in Erie, and then COVID hit and we never did that. So I'm thinking Kathy and I, since we like to walk and explore, maybe we'll end up doing some of that. So anyhow, you want to do that, Kathy, before you go to your next Airbnb vacation?
You can document the address.
Sure.
Anybody else? Do we have clarification? I'm gonna make a semi-decision here. This will be on the next, if you get it to us in ordinance form, Jake, we'll put it on the next meeting. I think it's time that we move on. That's good. I was gonna say poop or get off the pot. That's what Busha used to say.
Can we wait till August?
Why?
There really is a lot of pros and cons, though, really. It is a tough decision.
That's why we're here tonight. Yeah. But if you give us a read, what else could we gonna find out in August that we don't know by now? We got clarifications.
How about July? Because we're meeting whenever that is in July.
The will of the board, give me 4 and we're there.
We'll do it first.
First we could,
We're meeting on the 16th.
we're on one meeting in July.
Do that for July meeting.
So that'd be July 21st meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. That sounds fair to everybody?
16th or the 21st? Which date is it? July.
It's July 21st.
Okay.
Yeah, 21st is, I'm pretty sure. Wherever. Yeah. The third week would be the 21st. So we'll plan on a long evening at night. But I apologize for this. I just saw this sitting on my desk, and Mr. Betts and I know Peter Cook very well after yesterday. He's muted, so he can't make any fun. We had a bet, everybody knew. So he'll be wearing a prep jersey at the next meeting. There he is. Hello,
And
Mr.
bring it
Betts.
$1.
Oh, I forgot about the buck. If you wear the shirt, you can forget the buck. No problem. Okay, I think we're done then, huh? Anything else for the good of the order? Okay, have a good evening, folks. Love and kisses. See you